Um, I was deeply touched by hearing the discussion of democracy from the mayor and others who opened this program. We're not used to, I think, American political leaders thinking as deeply about democracy at the moment as they should be. Ours is barely functional. You've probably heard we were out, our government shut down for several weeks here. So our hope for democracy really rests much more in the citizens and their practices than I think it does in either established journalism as it's currently practiced in the US or by the government. And today I'm going to talk a bit about sort of journalism without journalists, democracy through citizens, not necessarily the traditional ways these things have operated, but the ways that I think we're seeing take shape at moments of dysfunctionality. Struggles of groups to find the ability to communicate their ideas and participate in discussions that they often have historically not been heard within because their groups have not necessarily been taken seriously by traditional journalists. As I do so, I'm going to talk a bit about my newest book, Spreadable Media, Creating Meaning and Value in a Network Culture, but also about a new book that I'm writing right now, which will be called By Any Media Necessary, Mapping Youth and Political Participation. And I'm going to talk a lot about young people in this talk. So one of the things we know about young people today is that they're not getting news in traditional ways. That is, young people in the US are not sitting down and watching the evening news or even CNN's hourly or half-hourly reports, and they're not sitting down in the morning and reading the morning newspaper. That all of the research we're seeing is showing that they're sort of snacking on news throughout the day. They're getting news from many different places, from everywhere and nowhere at the same moment in time. But much of the news they're getting is coming through information that's passed along to them by their friends, families, and other members of their social network. They are keeping each other informed. Some American political scientists talk about a shift from informed citizens to monitorial citizens. The informed citizen is the idea that we all know everything, that we're on top of every issue. And we now know that the complexity of the modern era makes that extremely difficult. The monitorial citizen counts on other people in their community following particular issues and alerting the community when action is needed. Sort of trusting each other to bring us into the conversation just in time. It's precarious, it's not secure, it's something that's still emerging, but it seems to be a good description of the way young people in the United States, and from my experience visiting other parts of the world, this is not uncommon elsewhere, are engaging with news and information. Now, often this relationship has been called citizen journalism. And here we see a top American newscaster saying, I would trust citizen journalism as much as I would trust citizen surgery. Right? That there's been a tension between professional journalists and so-called citizen journalists. Well, in my own work, I have problems with this phrase, citizen journalism. One, starting with the fact that I want journalists to think of themselves as citizens. Part of the problem with American journalism has been that journalists don't engage as citizens in the conversation of the society around them. They've been above it, they've been outside it, they've been, quote, objective, but they don't necessarily understand themselves as part of the process of democracy as strongly as they might. The second is that the word citizen here often gets read as amateur, not professional. As if those of us who are engaged in acts of communication were seeking to be professional journalists and somehow failing to do so. I'm a blogger. I blog 3 times a week. I write about a variety of issues affecting my society. But when I blog, I am not trying to be a journalist. I'm a university professor who sees blogging as a continuation of my professional responsibilities. In English, the word professor means to profess, to make knowledge available, to spread information. And so rather than seeing myself as an amateur journalist, I see myself as fully engaged in a professional practice, which I now have a capacity to communicate with new publics that I lacked before, right? That it changes how I do my job, and that's part of it. The third problem I have is that calling everything that we do in this new space journalism, it sort of doesn't deal with the fact that we are creating new functions for democracy, new ways of dealing with information, new ways of participating in discussion. And what's going on here is not a displacement of professional journalism by citizens, but an expansion of the range of relationships we have to news and information as a society. Some of those functions that journalists have still played are vitally important, that they remain at the professional level, hence the pushback of professional journalists to citizen journalists. There are things professional journalists can do that other people in the society are not situated to do because of the relationships they have, the resources they have, the training they have. They make a difference, and that's vitally important. But other things are emerging here that we need to understand if we're going to understand the environment in which news operates in contemporary culture. And that's really what my work here today is intended to address. So rather than thinking about a citizen journalist, I've talked more and more about what I call a civic ecology. That is the environment, the range of different things that add up to the system that allows us to be aware and engaged with the issues that are central to our democracy. The civic ecology here, we have an American cartoon character says, if it wasn't for blogs, podcasts, and Twitter, I'd never know what's going on. And I guess I shrug and say, well, it's a good thing we have blogs, podcasts, and Twitter, right? That if it's the case that young people in America would not be engaged in democratic citizenship without them, then it's a damn good thing we got them, right? That they're doing functions, they're connecting people together that we need to pay attention to, and we need to be aware of what's developing through those channels that allows for democracy to take place. Now, these are some data points on those trends. And these are taken from a variety of surveys. The numbers aren't going to add up. They're snapshots of changes that are taking place. But it says the average global internet user receives 26 stories per week via social media and email and shares 13 stories online. 92% surveyed, this is by the American-based Pew Center for Internet and American Life, surveyed said they got their news from multiple media platforms. 52% sought information from both online and offline sources. 72% follow news because they enjoy talking about what's happening in the news. In other words, in the world. In other words, news is a social currency. It's something people use to have conversations around. 69% keep up with the news as a social or civic obligation, an obligation we have to other people in our community. 50% rely to some degree on people around them to tell them the news they need to know. 75% get news forwarded through email or post on social network sites. 52% share links to news with others via those means. 51% get news items from people they follow. In other words, these are sort of redundant. They're telling us the same thing over and over. What they're telling us is something like that monitorial citizen model. They're telling us that we depend on each other for the information we need as citizens to engage within a democratic society. And we need to understand better how we do that effectively or not. Now, in my new book, Spreadable Media, we talk about circulation versus distribution. And I don't mean here circulation in the ways that journalists are used to talking about circulation, which in the American case usually is downward directed, right? That our circulation is down. Fewer people are reading the newspaper than read it last year. That sense of circulation is simply how many eyeballs look at your page. What I want to do is make a distinction between distribution, which is the way companies have distributed content, and circulation, which is the way a kind of ad hoc system where citizens play an ever more active role in shaping how content spreads across the culture. So distribution is, for example, the decisions about whether the Wall Street Journal is going to be available in Romania or not. Decisions about when American television shows may appear on networks here. Decisions about whether the film, the Hollywood release, say the next Hunger Games movie, will open at the same time in the US and in Europe. Those are corporate decisions of distribution. Circulation is what happens when citizens take media and spread it with or without authorization. They're the people who are passing the news items along. And an awful lot of what they're passing along is professionally produced content, but it's traveling differently within the culture than it did before, as people are sharing that media with each other, using it as resources for their conversations, engaging with debates around that content in ways that are increasingly visible to us because they're taking place through open communication channels. So this is the thrust of the book, Spreadable Media, whose slogan is, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. Now the word spreadable is tricky, and it seems like there's not a single European language it's easily translated into. I found this as I traveled across Europe last year talking about this book. In America, the early web was described as sticky. Success on the web was stickiness, that is, drawing people in and holding their attention on a fixed site for as long as possible. And I would argue that stickiness concept traces itself all the way back to broadcast media or print media, where success was grabbing people's eyeballs. We're using spreadable as a word that in America would suggest spreading jam on your bread or chocolate on your crepe or peanut butter on a sandwich. Those kinds of metaphors to describe something that's not sticky but is spreadable. People actively are spreading that content across the culture. So when I say if it doesn't spread, it's dead, what I mean is that things that are locked down in today's media environment lose value because they're cut off from the conversations people are having as they circulate media with each other, to other people. That is, that act of circulating makes something more current, more central to the culture. And so I'm very interested in this book and exploring what it means that the power to circulate media is increasingly in dispersed hands of everyday people, not totally under the control of traditional forms of distribution. Now, all kinds of things disperse through that system, and the examples here are going to be US-based. What I discover quickly is US-based examples don't necessarily connect at all when I talk about this overseas. Some of them might have spread through your communities here, some of them might not. These are things that everyone knows except when they don't. In other words, everyone knows them because they've passed through their inbox, but once you move to the people who are not in that network, they fall apart. So this is Susan Boyle, a British reality star who became an overnight celebrity in America, largely because her content was pirated and spread. And by the time her first album was released in the US, she outsold Whitney Houston, right, among American consumers. This is Cooney 2012, created by Invisible Children, a nonprofit organization in San Diego. It's a film about child soldiers in Uganda. They had predicted it would reach about 500,000 people in a 2-month period of time based on their previous success. Instead, it reached 70 million people in 4 days' time. Swamped their websites, led to the nervous breakdown of the person who made the film. They were simply unprepared for the extraordinary grassroots circulation of this, heavily by people that they built up a grassroots organization over time that seeded it, but it spread faster and further than they ever would have anticipated. This is Gangnam Style, the K-pop song that I think, again, many have been predicting for a while. Korean media would start to spread globally, but this was the tipping point in a way where we're seeing a pop song out of Korea develop a cult following. I'm seeing acknowledgments around the room that this is one that's known here as well. And this illustrates its role in the political debate in the United States. During the last presidential election, Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, used the phrase in one of the debates, binders of women. And he was referring to his affirmative action policy and said that he had put together binders of women to ensure that he had women in his administration. And the news media, mainstream media, paid no attention to that during their coverage of the debate. But if you were following on Twitter, almost every woman I know jumped on that and was reacting very negatively to that phrase. By the time it was over, people had already begun to mash up images about this phrase, binders of women, and it continued to circulate across American culture for the rest of the election cycle. It pushed the news media to pay attention to the affirmative action record of Mitt Romney, and everywhere they looked, the story fell apart. Right? He didn't solicit these binders of female candidates. They were given to him by a feminist organization that would have given any governor elected in Massachusetts. He did appoint some women to his government, but when they stepped down, he didn't replace them with women. The women he put into the governmental power were low-level government officials, not the top offices. And it turns out he needed the binders because of the company that he'd headed before he took over Massachusetts government. There were no women in the executive ranks of that company. So the more journalists looked, pressured by the circulation of this meme, the more it damaged Romney's reputation in an election where many people feel the female vote was a decisive one. The fact that many, many more women voted for Obama than Romney was one of several key factors that determined the outcome of the election. So each of these are examples of things that circulated on a grassroots level that have had a cultural, economic, and political impact that's far beyond individuals posting of things on Facebook, right? We've got to understand these as networked effects, as effects of large numbers of people working together, rather than as personal effects or personal choices. And some of these reached more eyeballs, if we go back to traditional standards, than broadcast content or Hollywood content did during the same period of time. So this is a shift of power that's potentially enormous. But the real shift is not the 1 million or 70 million viewers, videos that got 70 million views. It's videos that got 70,000 views. It is small groups, small individuals, communicators who got access to audiences that never would have heard their material before. Small niche publics, but publics that were interested in their message. That's the level in which the really dramatic change is taking place. Now, in the American context, the tendency has been to talk about these things in terms of them going viral. And I don't know if that's a phrase that's picked up here or not, but it's an expression that I think does us a disservice because it implies a kind of epidemic circulation. It implies a model of infection. And here we see a quote from science fiction writer Neil Stephenson, who was one of the first people to coin this phrase, going viral. And he says, we're all susceptible to the pull of viral ideas, like mass hysteria, or a tune that gets in your head that you keep on humming all day until you spread it to someone else. Jokes, urban legends, crackpot religions, Marxism. No matter how smart we get, there's always this deep irrational part that makes us potential host for self-replicating information. Well, think about all of the ways that turns the audience passive again. The very moment people are actively creating and circulating media, we're being told that they're doing so out against their own will, right? That they're susceptible, it's mass hysteria, it's something that gets stuck in your head, it's irrational, that we're hosts for self-replicating information. And in my field of cultural studies, we don't believe culture is self-replicating. We believe that humans create culture and humans circulate culture. And we need a language that actually gets to the essence of that. What choices are we making as human beings to share media with each other in such a way that it impacts our agenda as a society? And so calling it viral, to my mind, is altogether too passive a way of thinking about the changes that are taking place. In many ways, going viral allows people in power to hold on to the belief that they're still in power, when in fact there is some significant power shift taking place. So what I want to share with you today is, as I look toward my new book project, is work we've been doing looking specifically at young activists. We've now interviewed more than 200 American youth who are involved in a range of different networks, all funded through the MacArthur Foundation as part of a larger multidisciplinary effort to understand the political lives of American young people. And my work is mostly ethnographic. We're both interviewing people, we're spending time with these organizations, both online and off, and trying to understand how they think about the role of new media as citizens in creating awareness and engagement around issues that are important to them. So this is a list of just some of the key members of my team, postdocs and graduate students at USC that we're working with on this project. And these are going to be some of the groups that we've focused on. The Harry Potter Alliance is a group of young fans of the fantasy novel Harry Potter who are involved in human rights advocacy. Invisible Children, we've talked about, created 2012. Nerd Fighters is another online fan activity around 2 young adult authors. This represents the Dreamers, which is a group of undocumented youth, mostly born outside, who came to the United States at young ages as immigrants, who have been raised in the United States and are fighting for educational and citizenship rights as part of the larger immigrant reform effort. Students for Liberty is a libertarian, a somewhat right-of-center organization in the U.S. We wanted to look both at conservative and liberal uses of new media. And finally, 30 Mosque stands in here for a whole movement of a young American Muslim youth who have been who are trying to reshape their image using new media technologies after 9/11. So each of those are case studies in this larger project, and I'll draw on some of them as I continue with this talk. We understand all of this through a lens of participation. And the word participation is one that has carried a lot of resonance in American and European political theory, that we talk about participatory democracy or theories of political participation. It's a term that I've used throughout my career to talk about culture, how people create and share culture with each other in ever more active and visible ways as new media has come into play. And it's also a word increasingly used by the industry to solicit engagement in Web 2.0 platforms. Now, when I use the term participatory culture, I'm describing several hundred years of history of grassroots struggles to gain access to the means of cultural production and circulation. By contrast, Web 2.0 is a business model that's roughly 9 years old now that seeks to collect and commodify the participatory energies of the culture. So for me, these are not the same things. They're not equivalent terms, right? So we can hate Web 2.0 and embrace participatory culture as the central struggle of our time. Indeed, those who have the longest history of struggling over participatory culture, whether they're fan groups or activist groups, probably have the largest stakes and the best critique of how Web 2.0 operates, compared to many academics who have come relatively late to thinking about the question of participation. But around the world right now, there's a debate about what we mean by participation. And Chris Kelty, who I used to work with at MIT, writes that participating in Facebook is not the same thing as participating in a free software project, to say nothing of participating in the democratic governance of a state. Participation is about power, and no matter how open a platform is, participation will reach a limit circumscribing power and its distribution. So this is the core challenge. What do we mean by participation? What forms of participation are allowed or not allowed at different moments in different societies through different platforms within different communities for different participants, right? Those are the questions we have to be asking. Nico Carpentier, who I met last summer in Prague, uses a distinction between participating in and participating through media platforms that I think is really useful for thinking about these questions. So if you look at a platform like YouTube, it's participatory insofar as we are allowed to contribute our content, and YouTube makes money off the content we contribute, right? We can put our own content up there, but once we do, we lose control over our content in many ways. We have no say in the governance of Google as a corporation. YouTube doesn't provide a community of users that are critically engaged. It's mostly hate speech. Its mechanisms for discussion are really broken. And YouTube sets limits on what we can post there Some things are acceptable. The innocence of Muslims, for example, they refuse to take down despite riots across the Middle East. On the other hand, they ban pornography, and they're particularly strict on copyright violation. So they have a set of policies that were imposed on us, which we as consumers have no say in what those policies are. So it's scarcely an institution of democracy, per se, in its own terms. On the other hand, some of my colleagues at USC, a team headed by Kirsten Thorson, has been tracking the Occupy movement's use of YouTube and has found something like 100,000 videos posted by Occupy members around the world on YouTube, some intended just for archival purposes or very hyper-local purposes, some reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of viewers. If you contrast that to, say, a broadcast organization, let's say Fox News, Fox Corporation. Fox Corporation was not allowing very many Occupy messages out through its channels. It controlled content to a very high degree. So whatever we say negatively about YouTube, we have to acknowledge that, in fact, the platform enabled circulation of a massive amount of content that questioned the very corporate foundations of Google itself, right? That it was used as a political tool in other conversations, even though there was not a lot of democratic control over the platform and the tool itself. And that's the paradox we have to think about as we think about how political power is going to work in a new media environment. Now, the work my colleagues have been doing in terms of thinking about participatory politics, they're defining this new category in terms of forms of expression that are peer-based, interactive, and non-hierarchical, and that are not guided by deference to elite institutions. So using that definition, they've been trying to get a sense of how many young people are involved in practices that might be considered political using these new toolkits. And what they discover is most American youth do not involve themselves in political debates at all. Right? These numbers come from about 3 years ago after our US midterm elections. We're about to receive the numbers they've been collecting on the Obama-Mitt Romney election, when we expect these to be higher. But it turns out that American youth, by and large, what we discover is that if we look at those who are participating, the numbers across races are not radically different. It's not a matter of this is something that white suburban youth are doing and black youth, Latino youth are not doing. In fact, across the board, when young people become political, it is more often than not through these other channels of participation, through posting videos, through trading links, by talking about issues on Facebook and social media. So what we see there is 43% of white kids, 41% of black, 38% of Latino, and 36% of Asian American youth participate in at least one act of participatory politics during the midterm elections. By contrast, voting, black youth 52% voted, and Latino youth 27% voted. So the gap in traditional forms of political behavior is far more dramatic across racial categories than the gap in terms of participation on online channels. We seem to be closing the gap, at least among youth who are politically aware, in terms of what kinds of uses they're making of these platforms. And that's a significant data point as we look forward. What their data has also been finding is that youth who were active in interest-driven networks online were 5 times as likely as those who weren't involved to engage in participatory politics, and nearly 4 times as likely to participate in forms of institutional politics. So what the traditional measures in the US of civic engagement have suggested, young people are much more likely to be politically involved if their parents were politically involved, if they went to schools where politics was actively discussed in the classroom, if they participated in things like student newspapers, debate societies, student governments. And that behavior doesn't change very much after they reach 13, 14. That either they're going to be political or they're not. What we're discovering is that online social networks, especially those that blend between culture and politics, are another tool for recruiting young people into the political process. And for a significant number of young people, that is the way they're going to be involved politically in the future. That's where the key discussions are going to take place. And that that's not cut off from traditional forms of political participation, but it increases the likelihood of it. It doesn't guarantee it. It doesn't necessarily travel fast. Right now, young people are more involved politically online than offline. But the trend suggests that that online behavior is likely to generate greater political participation through traditional channels as well. So this is, I think, a very interesting set of trends. This guy is Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell has been a strong critic of the idea of so-called Twitter revolutions. Right? He sort of argues, he juxtaposes the U.S. civil rights movement of the 1950s with today's online activism, and sort of argues there was a much deeper commitment of activists to the cause in the 1950s than there is for young people getting involved online today. I think the problem is he's confusing a platform with a movement. Right? So if we were making equal things, we might talk about the telephone revolution of the 1950s and 1960s. Here's Martin Luther King, the leader of that civil rights movement in the United States, who's talking on the telephone, maybe to white political establishment, maybe to freedom riders, college students in the North who he's trying to recruit to be involved, maybe other black church leaders. But we would never reduce what Martin Luther King did or what political leaders of the 1960s did to what they did on the telephone, right? It's one tool among many that they used to organize. And so the reason we're calling my new book By Any Media Necessary is to evoke that idea that, in fact, when we look at the movements that are successful today, they're blending a variety of different forms of political communication. They're certainly taking advantage of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other such tools. They're also going door to door. They're printing things up. They're painting things on walls. They're holding public protests. The groups that have been successful have combined digital media with other kinds of political organizing. And that, I think, is going to be really important as we understand what's taking place. That yes, activism that only takes place online is not necessarily going to have deep impact on people's lives, but activism that expands its voice through online sources now has ways of getting messages out and heard by people that they would never have direct contact with, and that expansion of their voice is an important part of how democracy is going to work, at least in the American context. And we've seen similar things taking place around the world. So research is looking at the Egyptian student uprising, for example, finds that many of the young people first went online to participate in social networks, to participate in fan communities, to illegally download music, to watch movies online, to play games online. And gradually, based on the skills they developed there, they have moved into forms of political organization, have gotten more connected with each other, discovered shared discontent with the government, and took political action. So it's not Twitter set me free. It's that there was a kind of process that opened up for them in part because they were violating certain decrees of their government by using online material, online technology to download pop culture. They already stepped outside of governmental controls. And as they did so, they discovered their politics were no longer aligned with religious leaders or political leaders in their own country, and they fought to bring about some kinds of change. Ethan Zuckerman, who's a U.S. Theorist of political change, talks about the cute cat picture theory of democracy. And what Ethan is arguing is that any tool sufficiently robust to allow large numbers of people to trade cute cat pictures is powerful enough to bring down a government when the timing is right. Right? So what he's saying is that that people are acquiring skills, they're building a technical capacity, large number of people find their way into that channel, and it creates the preconditions through which transformative political speech can take place. And we're literally seeing in the US cute cat pictures being used for political purposes. So this is from a Class Warfare Kitty, a website that in the US is sort of fighting part of the Occupy movement. In this case, it's called using cute cats and hamburgers to call out the worker issues in the fast food industry in the United States. These are some cats that are involved in the fight over Obamacare, our medical care system that's going to, and so people have created cat pictures because the news media is much more interested in the infighting between Republicans and Democrats, or complaining about the website not working properly when it first set up, than they are actually explaining to people what the mechanisms of Obamacare are. And so the people have created these pictures to spread the message, to talk about Obamacare. And they're calling it the Adorable Care Act instead of the Affordable Care Act, which is the official name of the Obamacare legislation. Further out there, for some of you, may be the Harry Potter Alliance, which I alluded to earlier. This is 100,000 young people in 62 chapters involved in human rights activism. Their argument is that among American youth, that many of them learned to read, reading the Harry Potter books. They learned to write, writing Harry Potter fan fiction. And now they're learning how to be citizens by engaging in Harry Potter politics. Right? For better or for worse, this is a shared language. When you talk to these young people, they say that the language of politics and the language of news is both exclusive and repulsive. Exclusive in that you have to have a great deal of knowledge in order to enter into the conversation in the first place. You actually have to be deeply knowledgeable about government and policy to take the first step. And repulsive insofar as American politics is so characterized by bickering between the two parties that people are literally turned off by politics from the language in which it's conducted. And so what the Harry Potter Alliance is trying to do is find a different set of languages, a different set of stories and metaphors to use to talk about the political process. And they've been able to get young people involved in genocide issues, in issues of the environment, unequal marriage debates, labor debates, media concentration debates, through the use of language borrowed from Harry Potter. Let's skip over a few things. One of their causes right now is that they're involved in a campaign to go after Warner Brothers, the studio that makes the Harry Potter movies, to say that they want the chocolate that's produced in Harry's name to be from fair trade countries, right? To not be produced using child labor. They argue that there's something really disturbing about the idea of chocolate sold to children around a popular children's book being produced by child laborers in the developing world, and they want to challenge that by literally taking on the company that produces the media they're fans of. Right? So fandom, the shared belief in these stories, their investment in these stories, has given them a political platform by which to challenge the producers of those stories, and through that to educate other people about fair trade, about the debates around labor and child labor around the world. My graduate student, Netta Vilicek, talks about this in terms of mechanisms of translation. How do we move between languages? How do we express politics in different terms so that it can be understood by people who feel locked out of the political process? And how do we develop forms of political speech that will travel rapidly throughout young people's culture in ways that connect them to the world of news and politics? And she argues the Harry Potter Alliance and Nerdfighters in particular have been very effective at that. And the people who run that group, in the 1980s, people talked about culture jamming, that is blocking the signal, disrupting the operations of the mainstream media industry. The leadership of the Harry Potter Alliance talks about cultural acupuncture, that is tapping into the circulation system, rerouting the energies of the culture, but using the materials of mass media through grassroots media in order to challenge the conversations that they've been left out of previously. This is the second case that we're looking at. And this is the case of the dreamers, the undocumented youth. So I spent a lot of my career studying fan culture and popular culture. And so I was prepared to find some really interesting things taking place at the Harry Potter Alliance. But I was curious to see, are these same practices of using imagery from popular culture and using new media in effective ways spread across other groups that are defined by other kinds of axes? And the undocumented youth, the immigrant youth, are a traditional identity politics group that we would expect to have a very deep real-world commitment to the issues. We don't need other mechanisms to help them understand what it is being documented. They live that. But we discovered that, in fact, they are making very effective use of social media throughout their work, and often very effective use of social media to bridge between their own community and other communities. One of the things they're doing is very simple. They go online and they point the camera at themselves in their dorm rooms or their homes, and they tell their own story directly to the camera. And they come out as undocumented. They say, I'm undocumented, right? Now that first step is politically scary. That is, putting yourself on camera and announcing that you're illegally in the United States can result in you being deported, right? You can be kicked out of the country. But they discovered that they couldn't begin to organize with each other because they couldn't identify who was and who wasn't undocumented. It wasn't visible on your skin whether you're undocumented or not. These people come from all kinds of racial and ethnic, national backgrounds. They couldn't figure out who, they couldn't form solidarity until they identified each other. And coming out was first and foremost a way of organizing, a way of connecting. But secondly, they discovered that most Americans didn't know anyone that they knew was undocumented. Right? These are stories that weren't being told. These are stories that you wouldn't hear in the news media, that were stories of people's everyday lives. And so they found that by telling their stories through YouTube and circulating that video, that other people heard those stories and engaged with them in powerful ways. And we've seen over the last 3 years in the US some pretty radical shifts in public opinion toward undocumented youth and toward support of dreamers. Our government hasn't gotten behind changing the law, but the public opinion has shifted pretty dramatically in terms of how people think about these issues. Taking that further, they were going into immigration headquarters with web cameras attached to their bodies and webcasting what took place when they announced they were undocumented. It was an act of civil disobedience. They sort of sent to the world the message, we're willing to put our beliefs and our bodies at risk for what we believe in. And again, new media proved very, very effective as a way of doing that. Now, one of the stories they found themselves drawn to is the story of Superman. Right? And there had been a big debate in the United States about Superman. Superman had announced his U.S. citizenship and announced he was fighting for international justice. And American conservatives were very, very upset by this news. Well, the undocumented youth turned it around and said, when did Superman ever become a U.S. citizen? Right? That here is, if ever there was an illegal alien, it's Kal-El from the planet Krypton who crossed the U.S. border in the middle of the night, gets adopted by an Anglo family, lives and hides his true identity to the world, but nevertheless fights for truth, justice, the American way. So they turned Superman into the icon for the undocumented movement, sort of celebrating his immigrant origins and his contributions to American culture. And the result has been an idea that spreads very, very far. Again, I'm skipping over some stuff. We're describing, though, what's taking place here is extremely precarious. By precarious, I mean that there are lots of risk involved in this kind of political speech. For the group that we're just talking about, the undocumented youth, they come from the lowest strata economically in American society. There's not a lot of money behind them. They don't have a lot of money. New media has made it a lot cheaper for them to create messages and spread it to the world. But many of these young people don't have direct access to that technology. So these are people who we found bloggers who were, or social networkers who are running very effective campaigns without owning their own computers, going to schools and public libraries as their primary means of communicating to the world. So in their case, the risk is first of all being deported, and large numbers of them have been deported from speaking out on this issue. But also the risk was simply lack of access, the challenge of the unequal access to the means of communication in the current U.S. context. This third group we're looking at are American Muslim youth, who after 9/11 have been under a serious attack, right? The physical attack in some cases, walking down the streets, people calling anyone from that part of the world Islamic terrorist, right? Sikhs get attacked as if they're Islamic terrorists. Anyone who's brown basically walking in the U.S. city is potentially at risk as a result of the kind of public panic that's been generated by governmental leadership, by certain kinds of news coverage, and so forth. So these young people want to change that. And this white paper published by my postdoc, Sangeeta Shrestova, who's actually from Prague, whose parents are Nepalese. Sangeeta's work has been looking at how their struggle to tell their own story, using video to get the message out, using video to communicate to people who might not hear that message otherwise, using social media to challenge dominant representations of them in the news. There was a sort of hysterical Newsweek magazine cover about Muslim rage, and they used social media to sort of poke fun at its framing of the Islamic issues. But as they've done so, they've also faced growing concern over privacy issues, right? The privacy issues that affect anyone using the internet have been really central concerns for these young people. Both government surveillance, as we've discovered, the Obama administration has allowed an enormous amount of surveillance over U.S. citizens using digital technology. And there's plenty of documentation now that Islamic youth in particular have been targeted and profiled by those campaigns. So there's governmental surveillance, but at the same time, they're facing surveillance within their own family and their own communities as they go online. Older generation telling them they're not doing it right, that they're not behaving appropriately as Muslim women and young men, and trying to silence their speech within the family, within the community. And so they're struggling to get their messages out. And it doesn't take much to pull them back into their shell. So as we were doing our research, the bombing in Boston took place. Reddit, which is one of the major online communities, began to try to figure out who did the bombing. And the result was it posted a number of pictures of brown people at the Boston Marathon who they tried to figure out whether they were the terrorists or not. So the result was new media in this case was being used for racial profiling, for challenging, for sort of targeting young Islamic, or targeting American Muslim youth in very direct ways. And the result was that many of the voices we were hearing, many of the social networks we've been observing, went underground almost overnight. It had a chilling effect. It silenced people's voices in a very effective way. So ultimately, I'm very optimistic about the potentials of new media for new kinds of political speech, for new kinds of information to be spread, citizen to citizen, community to community. But we can't be too optimistic. We have to recognize these fundamental inequalities of access, of opportunity. We have to look at the risks young people are taking in their political speech. We have to look at the sort of challenges they face both within their own communities and across communities as they become more public in their voices. And for every gain we're seeing right now, we're seeing a variety of setbacks that make it harder for the next generation of young people to speak out on issues that are important to us. Now, I don't have a sense yet of what's taking place here in Romania around these platforms, around young people as citizens and activists. But I think what I've heard is really interesting stories around the world, not remarkably different from these. As young people develop their skills online, they are beginning to find their political voice as a generation. And this is part of what we have to understand as we think about the civic ecology, as we think about the world journalism works within, as part of a process of shaping democracy, but as one force among many that impacts the way we as citizens learn about the world. So now I will end my formal remarks. And I don't know if people have questions or